High above the valley floor, winter's grip was finally loosening. Day by day, the warming sun coaxed ancient snowfields to weep their meltwater down steep slopes, and the once gentle stream that wound through the forest began to swell. Dark thunderheads gathered overhead, as if drawn by the promise of unleashed power. By mid-afternoon, the river had transformed from a babbling brook into a churning torrent. Its banks, normally lush and green, were now sheathed in roiling brown foam. Every swollen wave struck the shoreline with a thundering crash, undermining tree roots and gouging new channels through the soft ground. Along the swift current, broken branches, uprooted saplings, and tangled reeds bombarded the water's edge. A mile downstream lay the village of Willowbrook, a cluster of timber cottages perched precariously close to the river's bend. From their windows, villagers watched in mounting alarm as the water lapped at the low wooden fence enclosing the central square. Children pointed with wide eyes. Farmers dashed to the barns to rescue tools and fodder. Elders stood on the bridge, peering into the frothing depths, mumbled prayers on their lips. It was clear this spring thaw was unlike any before. Even the old mill wheel, usually deafened by the river's seasonal surge, sank into uneasy silence as the current rushed past with unprecedented speed. Each groan of the wheel's axle sounded a dire warning. If the river breached its natural barriers, the entire valley could flood within hours. As the sun sank behind slate-gray clouds, a cold wind began to blow upriver, carrying with it the promise of further rain and more melt. In the gathering dusk, the villagers lit lanterns and convened by the bridge's edge, faces etched with worry. They knew the river's fury would not be spent without consequence, and that without swift action, their homes, their fields, and perhaps their very lives hung in the balance. A mile upstream, where the forest thinned into a willow-lined creek, the torrent's roar gave way to a gentler gurgle. Here, in the sheltered elbow of a moss-clad bank, lived Bulat the Beaver, master builder and silent guardian of these woods. Each dawn, before the first birds stirred, he emerged from his lodge-like den, broad flat tail swaying as he tested the air for danger. The creek here was narrow and shallow, barely a foot deep in summer's heat, but now swollen by spring runoff. Bulat approached the water's edge, his whiskers twitching at the sharp tang of fresh sap and damp earth. With powerful jaws, he stripped fresh willow and alder branches, selecting only the straightest saplings, worn teeth easily sheared though bark and pith. He piled them against the old dam, an intricate lattice of sticks, silt, and mud, pressing each one firmly into place with precise, practiced strokes of his tail. He paused at a small seep where the pressure of rising water had created a leak. Kneeling on his front paws, he hauled a heavy log from the bank, rolling it into the breach. Mud dotted his sleek chestnut fur as he plastered wet clay into every crevice, packing it tight with deft nips of his incisors. To an untrained eye, his work looked chaotic, but to Bulat, it was poetry, a living structure that bent and flexed with the current, channeling water safely through the spillway. All day he toiled, pausing only to dive and inspect the submerged foundations or to haul fresh vegetation for reinforcement. No human witnessed his efforts, only the forest itself, the ripple of water over his handiwork, the creak of bending branches, and the soft plop of mud clods settling into place. In that hidden sanctuary, Bulat labored tirelessly, ensuring that the rising creek would flow without fury, and that the valley below and the village of Willowbrook might awaken to calm waters rather than devastation. By dawn, the swollen creek was no longer the gentle ribbon of water Bulat knew so well. Beneath the soft pastel light, he sensed a growing tension in his dam. The usual murmur of water through the spillway had escalated into a deep, insistent rumble. From his vantage atop the central log, he watched the water's surface heave as pressure built behind his carefully woven barrier. Then came the first warning sign, a sharp, crystalline crack that echoed through the quiet forest like the snap of a giant's bone. Instantly, Bulat's whiskers trembled. He dove beneath the murky water to inspect the foundations, weaving through submerged branches until he found it. A length of supporting trunk, long weakened by winter's freeze, had split in two. A narrow fissure gaped open, and through it a thin jet of muddy water hissed, gouging fresh channels in the silt below. Every second widened the breach. The trickle escalated into a spray, then into a rushing torrent that threatened to undermine the entire structure. Above the dam, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Tree branches arched overhead, their leaves still with anticipation. Bulat lashed his tail against the water's surface in alarm, sending ripples dancing away from the fracture, an instinctive signal he reserved for dire emergencies. But there was no time to languish in panic. The creek's roar intensified, and upstream, the water level climbed visibly, eager to burst free. Down in Willowbrook, the villagers heard the distant thunder of rushing water and hurried to the riverbank. What they saw sent a chill through their hearts. A cascading wall of brown water gushed through a yawning gap in the Beaver Dam, flooding the low meadows and lapping at the base of their hastily erected sandbag barriers. Men and women scrambled to shore up the banks, tossing coils of rope and heaving fresh sacks of earth. But the torrent carved new channels with frightening speed, overtopping every obstacle they raised. Meanwhile, Bulat sprang into action. With powerful digs, he uprooted fresh saplings and dragged them upstream, where he wedged them into the expanding breach. His incisors flashed as he gnawed away soft clay from the riverbank, forming a makeshift buttress to support the splintered log. Each thrust of his head and lash of his tail drove sediment into the flow, slowing the surge long enough for villagers below to redirect the water into secondary channels. Together, with Bulat's urgent labor and the humans' frantic efforts, the rupture was contained before it could become a full-scale collapse. By midday, though the creek still raged, the worst had been averted. The dam held patched and bulging under pressure, while the villagers, panting and mud-splattered, shared awed glances. It was not solely their own work that had saved them, but the tireless ingenuity of the lone engineer upstream. The crack had nearly undone them all, but thanks to Bulat's swift intervention, the floodwaters were now channeled safely past Willowbrook, if only for a little while longer. At first light, Bulat awoke to an unfamiliar roar. The steady murmur of the creek had exploded into a relentless rush, as though the entire mountain had emptied its snowfields in a single breath. Emerging from his snug lodge, he padded warily along the dam's crest, the wooden structure groaning and sagging under the torrent's onslaught. Splinters of wet wood snapped beneath his paws, and rivulets of muddy water seeped through the woven lattices he had spent countless hours perfecting. He halted at the breach, an ugly gap where the rushing current had gouged away support, leaving exposed roots trembling in the flow. The water punched through with such force that it carved away clods of clay and swept sapling after sapling downstream. Bulat's whiskers twitched with urgency. Without swift action, the dam would collapse entirely, unleashing a flood that would drown the valley below. With a defiant chuff, he dove into the frigid water. His sleek body sliced beneath the surface as he inspected the dam's submerged foundations. He noted where the pressure was greatest, where logs had loosened, where clay had washed free, and where the tangled root mass had given way. Then, rising just upstream, he gathered fresh willow saplings in his jaws, their green branches slick with dew. Muscles rippling, he lugged each trunk to the breach and jammed it into place, angling them against the current like stout ribs bracing a ship's hull. Between each placement, Bulat worked mud into the nooks with frantic nips of his chisel-sharp teeth, packing the silty clay around the new logs until the flow slowed to a manageable trickle. Yet every repaired section seemed to yield moments later under the torrent's weight. Realizing he needed bulk as well as finesse, he turned to the riverbank and began excavating a deep trench, undermining a fallen alder to serve as a massive buttress. With monumental effort, digging with his tail and prying with his powerful jaws, he levered the trunk sideways into the breach, its heavy girth anchoring the flimsy sapling framework. All day he toiled, venturing upstream to harvest fresh building materials and downstream to inspect his handiwork, the dam growing thick with layered logs, brush, and packed clay. But he was not alone in this effort. Word of the flood's danger had carried to Willowbrook, and soon curious villagers, foresters, farmers, even children, ventured upstream, drawn by the beaver's frantic labor. Seeing him haul logs single-mindedly, they took up his cause, tossing shovelfuls of earth, weaving branches into the lattice, and hammering stakes into the creek bed under Bullett's silent guidance. By midday, the combined efforts of man and beaver had forged a new bulwark, stronger, broader, and more flexible than before. The water now flowed through a controlled spillway, its muddy banks reinforced by interlaced roots and the massive alder buttress. As the current steadied into a steady roar instead of a destructive cascade, Bullet climbed atop the dam and plucked a stray twig from his fur, sending it drifting harmlessly downstream. Below, the villagers cheered as they watched floodwaters divert safely away from Willowbrook's fields and homesteads. Though drenched and weary, they recognized the true architect of their salvation, a solitary beaver whose instinctual brilliance had averted disaster. And as Bullet slipped back into the creek's calmer waters, his chestnut coat gleaming in the afternoon sun, the forest itself seemed to exhale in relief, its quiet engineer once again master of his domain. By mid-morning, the roaring floodwaters had swelled into a relentless surge, threatening to breach the hastily reinforced banks downstream. Yet here, at the heart of the crisis, Bullet the beaver labored with tireless determination. He stood waist-deep in the swirling creek, his chestnut fur plastered to his sleek frame, incisors gnawing through supple willow branches with rhythmic precision. Meanwhile, along the bank, the villagers of Willowbrook gathered, farmers, carpenters, and even the village blacksmith, each drawn by the beaver's frantic energy. At the headman's urging, they formed a human flank to Bullet's aquatic engineering. Men heaved wheelbarrows of clay, women carried bundles of brushwood, and children scampered with stakes and saplings, their small hands eager to help. Though at first uncertain how to assist a creature of tooth and tail, they quickly fell into step with Bullet's silent guidance. The beaver dove beneath the murky surface, emerging moments later with a thick alder log clamped firmly in his jaws. He hauled it to the breach, where the water threatened to gouge away the dam's heart, and positioned it parallel to the current, its weight anchoring the loosened framework of saplings. Instinctively understanding his intent, two burly farmers gripped the log's ends and drove it deeper into the streambed, jamming it into place against the dam's core. A third villager then shoveled damp clay into the gaps, packing it tight with the edge of his shovel, while Bullet reinforced the edges with brush and smaller sticks. Each new layer of material followed Bullet's silent blueprint. Where his whiskers twitched and his tail slapped the water, volunteers placed fresh branches. Where he chiseled clay with his teeth, they followed with shovelfuls of earth. The blacksmith, spotting a weak joint between logs, hammered stout wooden stakes downstream to bind the structure together. Sparks from his anvil flashed like fireflies in the rising spray, and the keen ring of metal on wood lent the ritual a sense of solemn collaboration. As the hours passed, the dam transformed from a crumbling barrier into a bulwark of interwoven timber, mud, and root. Bulky trunks formed a sturdy spine, woven brushwork filled voids, and the final coat of packed clay sealed every seam against the press of water. All the while, Bullet patrolled its crest, diving to check the submerged foundations, and surfacing to chuff his approval in low, satisfied grunts. At last, the torrent's fury abated. Where the breach had once gaped, now a controlled spillway directed the floodwaters safely around Willowbrook's meadows. The villagers stood shoulder to shoulder on the bank, mud-spattered and panting, as they watched the water rush through the new channel, with no threat to their homes. Bullet climbed proudly onto the dam's apex and, with one final sweeping lash of his tail, sent a gentle cascade of droplets into the sunlight. A wave of relief and admiration swept through the onlookers. Children cheered, elders clasped the hands of their neighbors, and the headman raised his voice in gratitude, not just for the beaver's instinctual genius, but for the bond forged between man and nature that had saved them all. In that moment, beside the roaring creek, the people of Willowbrook recognized that true strength lay in collaboration. The beaver's craftsmanship guiding human hands, and human gratitude honoring the quiet engineer of the forest. Morning light filtered through the trembling willow boughs, setting the creek's surface ablaze with liquid gold. Where yesterday's torrent had roared, now only a gentle murmur remained, as floodwaters peacefully slipped through Bulat's reinforced spillway. The air smelled of wet earth and fresh sap, and dragonflies skimmed the water's edge in dizzying loops. Along the bank, the villagers of Willowbrook gathered once more, this time with smiles instead of worry. Children tiptoed across the dam's crest, testing its stability by tossing tiny pebbles into the calm pool below and marveling as concentric rings rippled outward. Farmers knelt at the spillway's outflow, cupping the clear water and tasting its sweetness. This new channel promised reliable irrigation for parched fields come summer. Even the old miller returned from the bridge, noting with approval that his wheel now turned at a steady, controlled pace. From beneath a tangle of brush, a soft plop announced Bulat's emergence. He padded onto the dam's crest, chestnut fur still flecked with clay, and paused to survey his handiwork. Here and there he nipped at a stray twig that threatened to loosen, his incisors chipping away at rough bark before packing fresh mud into the seam. Wherever the water's gentle pulse wore a groove too deep, he dove and deposited willow sprigs to cushion the current. His movements were fluid, equal parts precision and instinct, ensuring that the dam would flex with each seasonal swell without giving way. On the far bank, a group of villagers, carpenters and gardeners among them, had begun planting native reeds and cattails in the newly quiescent shallows. Their roots would bind the streambed and provide habitat for frogs, minnows, and water birds. A pair of mallards glided across the water, followed by a flotilla of ducklings, their downy heads bobbing in curious unison. In the alders overhead, the cheerful trill of warblers and kinglets heralded the return of spring nesting. As afternoon shadows stretched across the valley, Bulat slipped downstream to inspect the secondary overflow channel. Sunlight danced on the gently rippling water, revealing darting fish and writhing tadpoles. He watched a heron stoop in graceful balance, snatching its breakfast from the shallows, and then turned back upstream, tail high with pride. Later, the headman of Willowbrook led a small procession to the dam's summit, carrying baskets of apples and fresh bread as tokens of gratitude. They laid the offerings at Bulat's favorite rock, just above the spillway, and bowed their heads in silent thanks to the beaver who had engineered their salvation. Bulat approached with measured curiosity, sniffed each gift, and then retreated into his lodge, content that balance had been restored. That evening, a hush fell over the valley as the last lanterns flickered out. Beneath a sky pricked with stars, the creek flowed with renewed grace, its every ripple a testament to collaboration between man and nature. And at the heart of it all, Bulat remained vigilant, the tireless architect of wood and water, whose quiet genius had transformed a catastrophe into a flourishing new ecosystem. Spring had folded into summer, and the valley of Willowbrook hummed with renewed life. The creek, once a roaring menace, now traced a steady, silvery ribbon through emerald reeds and sunlit meadows. Dragonflies danced above the water's mirror, while swallows skimmed the surface, dipping to sip mid-air. Every ripple in the stream seemed to carry a quiet testament to what had been saved and what had been born anew. On a golden morning, the villagers gathered at Bulat's dam, not out of fear or urgency, but in celebration and gratitude. Carpenters had built a simple wooden footbridge across the spillway, allowing safe passage and close observation of the beaver's craftsmanship. Children clustered at its railings, sketchbooks in hand, their laughter a bright counterpoint to the gentle murmur of water below. Farmers stood nearby, their arms laden with baskets of ripening berries, fresh eggs, and wildflowers, offerings to their unlikely hero. From his lodge's entrance, Bulat emerged with measured calm. His chestnut fur gleamed in the morning light, and the slightest twitch of his whiskers conveyed both curiosity and welcome. He padded onto the dam's crest, inspecting each log and twig with the same care he had shown during the flood's darkest hours. At the sight of woven baskets at the bridge's foot, he chuffed in recognition, then approached the nearest child, tiny fingers outstretched, to accept a single plump raspberry. With gentle precision, he nibbled the fruit, dark juice staining his whiskers, before he trotted back to survey his work. As the villagers watched, the headman spoke softly of lessons learned, how a single creature's instinctual ingenuity had harnessed the torrent rather than battled it, how humans and wildlife, working side by side, could forge resilient defenses far stronger than either alone. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and one by one they laid their offerings upon Bulat's favorite rock, symbolic pillars of trust between forest and village. After the ceremony, a schoolmaster led the children on a nature walk downstream, pointing out newly stabilized banks where cattails took root. Frog spawn dotted shaded pools, and minnows darted beneath submerged willows. He explained how Bulat's dam had created critical habitat, slowing water, trapping sediment, and inviting life to flourish. In every lesson, Bulat's silent presence served as living proof that small, dedicated acts of stewardship could reshape an entire ecosystem. As dusk fell and lanterns flickered along the footbridge, Bulat returned to his lodge, tail swishing contentedly. The creek's lullaby whispered around him, a song of harmony restored, of communities bound by mutual respect, and of a future where the wisdom of one humble rodent would echo through generations. And high above, the willow boughs swayed in gentle applause, their leaves murmuring, the forest's guardian had claimed his place, not as conqueror, but as collaborator, forever woven into the living tapestry of Willowbrook.